Today we're exploring the question, is morality subjective or objective? So across different cultures and beliefs, we act as if morality is a real thing. We judge some actions as good and some actions as bad. And so then the question becomes, why do we feel this way? And are we justified in feeling this way? Is morality simply a reaction in the brain? Is it something we evolved to survive? Or is it really just personal opinion? Or does morality point to something beyond us that is objective? So we're going to explore each one of these possibilities. The first explanation is that morality is just what's happening in the brain. We know that certain regions of the brain are active when we make moral decisions, and that chemicals are released when we feel things like empathy or guilt or outrage or even compassion. And so some people say, see, that's all morality is. It's just neurons firing and chemicals flowing. There's nothing more to it than that. And it is true that our brains are involved in everything we experience, including morality, so thoughts, emotions, choices. And it's really cool that we can see these moral decisions show up in brain scans. But the fact that our brains are involved in moral decisions does not mean that morality comes from the brain. So using an example like eyesight, we can map what is happening in the brain when we see something like a tree. We see certain neurons firing, certain pathways lighting up, but we don't say, because I can measure the brain activity, the tree's not real, right? The brain data tells us how we experience the tree, but it does not tell us whether or not the tree exists outside of the brain. And in a similar way, brain activity during moral decisions might tell us how we're experiencing morality in the brain, but it does not tell us if morality connects to something real outside of us, outside of the brain. And there's another problem if we say that morality is only in the brain, because we know that feelings themselves do not create moral truth. And what I mean when I say that is that we can feel afraid when we are perfectly safe, or the reverse, we can feel calm in a genuinely dangerous situation, or, perhaps we're all familiar with feeling anger when we're the ones actually in the wrong. So our emotions can be out of sync with reality. And this means that the chemical states that are in our brain cannot tell us what's actually right or wrong. So neuroscience can describe the mechanism, what the brain's doing when we judge something to be moral or immoral, but it does not tell us if morality is real, or whether right or wrong exist independently of our brains. Sharon Dirks, who has a PhD in brain imaging, says, "Am I just my brain is not simply a scientific question. It taps into questions of identity that science alone cannot answer." And this quote comes from her book, where she's asking the question of whether a brain can fully explain consciousness or if the mind is more than biology. So if you're curious, if you want to explore this angle in more detail, you can check out the description where I'll link to it. Okay, the second explanation is that morality evolved as a survival strategy, which would mean that there's no such thing as morality in any ultimate sense, that rather morality is just behavior that has helped human groups survive and reproduce over time. And it's usually explained like this. There were early human groups who cooperated and shared food and protected each other and cared for children, and those groups were more likely to survive than groups who were constantly stealing from each other or killing each other or cheating each other, that those groups would fall apart. So over time, traits like empathy and fairness and loyalty were naturally selected, and now, as a result, we have strong feelings about those behaviors. And there's probably some truth to this, right? It does make sense that in a world with no cooperation, it would be hard to live in that world. So survival can absolutely help explain why some moral behaviors are liked and why others are disliked. But the explanation's incomplete when we think about the kinds of people who we really admire in the world. Like the whistleblowers who are willing to expose corruption and then lose their job and reputation as a result. Or the people who hide refugees during a genocide and they risk imprisonment or their own death. Or strangers who, run into a building to save a person or an animal, even one they've never met. None of these actions increase their personal survival or comfort. And you could say, well, they actually do improve survival because they improve a person's social standing in the community. And there's truth to that, right? Being virtuous can improve how others see you, which could, lead to survival and reproduction. But that explanation only works when our actions are visible. If no one knows about the sacrifice, then there's no reputation boost, no applause, no social reward, no survival benefit. Examples of this could be making anonymous donations where no one's ever going to know, or choosing to tell the truth when lying would make you look better, and when you wouldn't get caught. So these actions don't benefit our survival or self-interest, and they may even hurt us, and yet we would still call them good. So, survival-based morality can tell us why cooperation is useful, but it doesn't explain why we feel obligated to do what's right at our own expense, or when there's no reward. The next explanation is that morality is subjective, meaning there's no such thing as a true right or wrong, that there are only preferences. There are my preferences, there are your preferences, there are the preferences of different cultures and different times. So I could say something like, lying's always wrong. And you could say, well, lying's okay if it helps you. And maybe another culture normalizes something that we find absolutely shocking. But if morality is subjective, then none of us is actually right. We're just feeling strongly about our own opinions, our own preferences. So maybe that would be because of how we were raised, or maybe it's because those preferences benefit us personally somehow. And this explanation, the idea that morality is subjective, is appealing because, it sounds humble and tolerant. Conversely, it avoids sounding judgmental, two good things. And it's also acknowledging that cultures really do differ. And there's partial truth to that, right? Because cultures do differ in how they express moral ideas. So what counts as respectful, which clothes are considered modest, how you can show someone hospitality, what gestures are polite. These are real differences in application. But the tension is that when we move from small issues to serious ones, almost none of us truly believe that morality is just a matter of personal preference anymore. Right? Imagine someone saying that human trafficking's not wrong, it's just part of their culture. Right? Everything in us probably pushes back, and we're thinking, no, human trafficking is wrong. It shouldn't happen to anyone, anywhere, ever. And notice that when we say something like that, we're not saying I personally wouldn't choose that. Rather, we're saying that should never happen to any human being. And the same goes for, other things like torturing children or animals for fun, or genocide, or racial slavery. We might disagree on the little details, but almost everyone agrees that some things are really, actually, always wrong. And if we're honest, even those of us who think that morality is relative, we often don't live that way, right? If someone lies about us, or steals from us, or deeply hurts someone we love, we don't just shrug and say, oh, well, that's their truth. Right? Instead, we think you shouldn't have done that. And in feeling that way, we're appealing to a standard that they should be living by, that we should all be living by, that's beyond personal preference. So the morality is subjective view doesn't really match the way we experience right and wrong. We don't treat morality like a private taste, the way we treat our favorite ice cream flavors. Rather, we treat it like something that's real, something that people can be right or wrong about. C.S. Lewis says it like this: if no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things as something different from each other, you are in fact comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer, and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each means merely the town I am imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other, no sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. I conclude, then, that though the difference between people's ideas of decent behavior often make you suspect that there is no moral natural law of behavior at all, yet the things we are bound to think about these differences really prove just the opposite. This comes from his book, Mere Christianity, and the whole book is so good, so in case you want to read that one, I'll also link to that in the description. Okay, so if morality is objectively right or wrong, then that means we did not invent it. Rather, we're responding to something that exists outside of us, something that we discover rather than create. And if morality is something that we're discovering, not just creating, then the question becomes, where does this moral law come from? So here's how I've heard different apologists describe it that make good sense to me. So the first is that when we're saying something's evil, we're assuming that there is such a thing as good and a way things ought to be. And when we talk about good and evil, then we're assuming there's a real difference between the two, right? It's not just personal preference. And so then if there's a real difference between good and evil, then there's got to be some kind of standard above them that tells them apart. And this standard is what we might call a moral law. If there is a real moral law that stands above our opinions and cultures, then there must be a source of that law, a moral lawgiver, if you will. And Christians, of course, call this moral lawgiver God. And we can phrase this argument in the negative as well. We can say, if there's no God, then there's no such thing as an ultimate moral law, just personal preferences, just survival patterns, just brain states. But if there's no moral law, then there's no real right and wrong. There's only things we like or dislike. And if there's no real right and no real wrong, then there's actually no such thing as evil in any real sense. Only actions that make us personally uncomfortable. And of course, as we've already discussed, most of us are not willing to say that things like child abuse or human trafficking or genocide are merely uncomfortable or against our taste. We react as if they're actually wrong. And the moment that we insist that some things are truly objectively wrong, we are also saying that some things are truly objectively good. And then we're back to this idea of a moral reality that does not depend on us humans. So Christianity claims that this moral reality isn't just an abstract principle, but rather it's the character of a person, of God, and that God's own character is the standard of goodness. And the reason we humans feel an innate sense of things being objectively right and objectively wrong is because we're made in God's image, that he instilled this moral law in us, or as Paul says in Romans, that God wrote the moral law on our hearts. So in other words, our sense of ought, our sense of conscience or hunger for justice, it's not an accident. It's one of the many ways that God has marked human beings with his moral imprint. So summing up, we have good reason to believe that morality is objective, not subjective. And if it is objective, then it has to come from somewhere. Christians call this God. I am curious in the comments, what's your take? Do you think that morality is subjective or objective, and why? Of course, if you have any general questions about Christianity or apologetics, go ahead and put them there in the comments as well, and I will do my best to respond there or in a future video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.